All right, so I have two topics today. Thank you for bearing with me with my technical moments. We have two topics today. The first one is going to be Nishtana, and the second is going to be the Arbat Banim. And the truth of the matter is that I think we'll see that they're connected. So I want to start with Nishtana. And we're going to start by looking at the Mishnah, and I think we'll see that what we see in the Mishnah is not exactly what we say at Leil Seder. So we start with Vim ein dat beben aviv melamdo. Okay? I'm sorry, I skipped the line. Mazgulo kos sheni, they would pour the second cup. We've had the first cup, that's Kiddush. We pour the second cup. V'kan haben shoel aviv. And now is when the son asks questions of the father. Okay? Vim ein dat baben aviv milamdo. And if the son does not have dat, lacks some level of competence, awareness, intelligence, whatever it is, then his father teaches him. Now, there's actually something pretty interesting going on in this Mishnah, because the next words are, Ma nishtana laila ze mikol halelot. What is the difference between this night and all other nights? And the truth is that you could kind of take this phrase of, Im ein dat baven aviv milamdo, and you could attach it to the beginning of this Mishnah, or you could attach it to the next part of the Mishnah. That is to say, I learned this from one of my teachers, Rabbi Dr. Chaim Bergansky at Bar Ilan. You could say, Mazgula kosheni, the kana ben shoel aviv. Here the son asks the father, and if not, the father teaches him. Done. And now let's see what the son asks his father. Ma nishtana laila zeh. The second possibility, kana ben shoel aviv. Here, the son asks the father, and the imein dat baven aviv milamdo, and if the son doesn't have da'at, the father teaches him. And what does the father teach him? Ma nishtana laila zeh mikol halelot. How is this night different from all other nights? In other words, it could be, it's a plausible reading of the Mishnah. Then, in fact, we talk a lot in education these days about flipping the script. Who's saying what? It's possible that even though it's very entrenched that, of course, the child recites the Ma nishtana, that first of all, that a set text of questions was not necessarily always the expectation or is not necessarily a requirement. And secondly, that it really could be that what we think of as the four questions are in fact the 4 points that a father makes when he's helping his child begin to ask questions at the Seder. And if we think about it, what's the content of the questions? We're always talking about how is this night different from another night. In the Haggadah of Nechama Leibovich, they highlight in her name how these aren't just questions, these are kushiot. A kushia is when you're comparing one thing to another and showing how they kind of bump into each other. But these kushiot aren't like kind of open questions. What is matzah? These are designed to entice a child into another level of curiosity so that we can tell the story of Leil Seder. So it's plausible that our 4 questions are in fact the 4 statements that the parent should be making to get his child or her child to develop their own questioning. All right, well, let's look at, and by the way, the Rambam might imply this. If you look at here where I have the asterisk, the Rambam in the Mishnah Torah says, V'kana ben shoel, paraphrasing the Mishnah, here is when the son asks, Ve'omer hakoreh ma nishtana. And the person who's reciting the Seder says, Ma nishtana. In other words, it's not the son, according to the Rambam here in this halacha, who's saying Ma nishtana. It's the leader of the Seder. Of course, that's not how things develop. Let's look at what the text actually says according to the Mishnah. So in the Mishnah, we have, Shebachol halelot anu ochlin chametz u'matzah, laila ze kulo matzah. On all the nights, we eat chametz or matzah. Tonight, it's only matzah. There's another question. We're going to come back to why I kind of put it indented here. Then on all other nights, we eat a range of vegetables. Tonight, maror. Tonight, we eat maror. Then other nights, we eat meat when it's roasted, when it's kind of heat soaked, when it's cooked. Halayla hazeh kulo tzali. Tonight we eat meat only that has been roasted. Now we're going to have to think about that because nowadays, for many of us, the custom is not to eat any kind of roasted meat whatsoever on Leil Seder. That's because, of course, it used to be that the centerpiece of Leil Seder was the Korban Pesach. The Korban Pesach had to be roasted. Initially, this question comes from the time of Beit HaMikdash, it would seem, when there was a Korban Pesach. And then what would happen is that we would be highlighting through this question that specifically on Leil Seder, we have something that's only roasted, i.e. the Korban Pesach. Rambam here makes the point. He says, he talks about reclining and not reclining. And then he says, nowadays, i.e. not in the time of Mikdash, we don't say that we eat only roasted. Shein lanu korban, because we no longer have the korban. And that's the way the questions have changed. And I would add that it's possible that someone even after the time of Beit HaMikdash might have said something about roasted versus not roasted, because there were some generations where in many locales, Jews had the custom of eating specifically roasted meat on Seder night in order to serve as a sort of memory of the Korban Pesach. Widespread custom now is the opposite. We stay away from roasted foods to make it clear that we no longer have the Korban Pesach, and we're not pretending that we do. Or we're not causing some kind of confusion about the nature of the food that we're eating or what you can do with the korban. But initially, even after the time of Beit HaMikdash, this still might have been a germane question. Okay, and then shebechol halelot anu matbilin pam achat, halel hazeh shtei pamim. For on all the nights we dip our food once. Tonight we dip twice. Now, this also probably sounds different from the question that you're used to saying in the Seder. And in fact, if you look in the Gemara, they correct this. Amar Rav Safra, Rav Safra said, Hachi katani, here's what it means to teach. On all other nights, ein anu matbilin afilu pamachat. On other nights, we don't dip, not even once. Tonight, we dip twice. Now, that reflects what we say and what we do. And that reflects already what was Babylonian practice, what was practiced in the time of the composition of the Batei Midrash, from which we learn what's in the Talmud Bavli. But actually, initially, it used to be that it was a common accepted facet of any meal that one would begin with some sort of dipped appetizer. So the initial question of, on all other nights we dip once, tonight we dip twice, was a question about why do we dip more than once when we usually dip once? Already in the time of the Talmud, that stopped being a question that made sense because people weren't dipping regularly. Now, what was the two dipping that specifically was being done? Oftentimes when we think about the dipping, we think about discussions of karpas, where the classic explanation given, among others, is that we're trying to arouse the curiosity of our children, which is exactly what this question of the Nishtana seems to be doing. But the truth of the matter is that there's another historic layer to this. It is most likely that initially the second dipping of a vegetable was in fact the maror. We know that maror is really supposed to be eaten first dipped in charoset. Okay, we shake the charoset off, but supposed to be dipped. And that was how it was customarily eaten. So originally, the question of shebechol halot anu mapilim pam achat, halal hazeh shtei pamim, on all other nights we dip once, tonight we dip twice, was initially a question about, on all other nights we have an appetizer course that we dip, but tonight we're dipping twice, and that was an opportunity to discuss the maror. Okay, it was an opportunity to discuss maror. So our initial set of questions, okay, and then you can say, well, what happened to maror? And here's the interesting thing: the question about other vegetables versus maror is not present in some of the older manuscripts of the Mishnah, or let's say in the Mishnah that appears in the Talmud Yerushalmi. It seems then that initially there were not 4 questions, if we want to call them questions. They're not just statements to arouse questions by the Seder leader. There were initially not 4, but there were 3. Chametzu matzah, batzar tzli, okay, the question about matzah, the question about the Korban Pesach, and the question about dipping, which was actually a way of getting to the use of the maror. Okay, once dipping became something that we never did at all, and that question changed, we wound up bringing in this idea that we had a separate question to talk about the maror, and we came to 4. Now we've switched the question about eating korban pesach, roasted, for the question we have nowadays about eating leaning versus seated, but that's not an original question in the Mishnah. Okay, if we put this together and we say that originally these 3 questions dealt with, respectively, matzah, the korban pesach, or roasted meat, and the second dipping, or rather, maror, we come up with a trio that actually is exactly the subject of the next section of the Mishnah. Because the next section of the Mishnah goes on to bring Rabban Gamliel. Rabban Gamliel would say, Kol shelo amar shlosha dvarim elu b'Pesach lo yetza yedei chovato, ve'elu hen, Pesach, matzah, or maror. Rabban Gamliel would say, anyone who has not mentioned any of the following 3 things on Leil Seder has not discharged their obligation. We could argue, and I'm sure when you learn it later, you'll discuss whether it's the obligation in telling the story or the obligation of even eating them, if you have to tell the story to discharge the obligation of eating them. But either way, these key elements of the Pesach story that must be told are Pesach, matzah, umaror. So it's actually quite likely that the original Nishtana, as it were, was really entirely geared towards opening up the discussion that Rabban Gamliel tells us that we have to have about Pesach, about matzah, and about maror. And that makes a lot of sense, because if we really think about Pesach, about matzah, and about maror, these 3 elements of the Seder can almost single-handedly serve as sort of symbolic shorthand for the entire Pesach story. Matzah, maror, let's start with maror. Maror, if we take it as Ve'maroru et chayehem, as we say in the Leil Seder, quoting from Sefer Shemot, that the Egyptians embittered our lives. Maror would represent then slavery. Pesach, we bring the korban pesach, but it's in recognition. We say this in the Torah of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. We'll see this pasuk in a little bit, of HaKadosh Baruch Hu being poseach, of HaKadosh Baruch Hu having the malach skip over our homes so that we are not subject to makat b'chorot, and that's the beginning of our redemption. And then matzah, as I'm sure we've talked about in Halach Ma'anya, matzah, which represents not just the bread of affliction, but also represents the bread of redemption. Because as we're leaving Egypt, when we're redeemed, it's matzah that we bring with us. So really, if we put them in a slightly different order, maror, Pesach, and matzah, there's good reason for them to be the key pillars of our Magid. And the structure, the deep structure of what we want our children to be asking about or thinking about symbolically at the Seder, because they really tell us the story of Yetziat Mitzrayim in a condensed way, okay? And when we think about the ways that we tell the story, and that all 3 of these elements tell the story, it becomes even more rich to recognize that initially, of course, when we would eat the Korban Pesach, all 3 of these elements would be, as it were, eaten together. Every element of the story, whether it was the slavery, Hashem saving us, our redemption and coming out of Egypt, were all together. When we say about Korban Pesach, Hamatzot U'Morim Yochluhu, because we would eat the Korban Pesach with the matzah and with the maror. So that's an introduction to the Nishtana. And what's so interesting about the Nishtana is it actually really sets the background for understanding what's going on with the 4 sons, okay? And to understand what's happening with the 4 sons, I want to start by looking at sort of the transition within the Haggadah of moving from the Nishtana to the 4 sons. What do we have? We have Nishtana, item number 1 on this list, right? Asking these questions. We have the response, Avadim Ayinu leFaro b'Mitzrayim. We were slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt, and through this response, we also get to one of the core elements of telling the story of leaving Egypt, which is that we start from Gnut and we end in Shvach. We start with our disgrace and we end with the praise. So we start off by saying we were Avadim. Elsewhere, we'll talk about how we started off as idolaters long before the Pesach story. Number 3, we have the story of the Rabbanim that were reclining together in Bnei Brak. And what are they reclining together in Bnei Brak doing? They're telling the story. They're talking about Yetziat Mitzrayim all night long. Then we have Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah telling us that he was Hareni Keven Shivim Shana. He became like 70 years old, right? His hair goes white overnight when he has to take on a leadership role in a sudden fashion. And it's only at that point, it's only later on in his life that he recognizes that the mitzvah of telling the story of the Exodus from Egypt is both in the day and at night. And then we have this interesting phrase out of nowhere. Baruch HaMakom Baruch Hu, Baruch Shenatan Torah L'Amo Yisrael Baruch Hu. Blessed is God, blessed be He, blessed is He who gives Torah to the people of Israel, blessed is He. What's going on with our flow? Nishtana, in a sense, is opening up our discussion of Yetziat Mitzrayim already, if we build on what we said at the beginning of this year, already taking into account the 3 major elements that we're going to be focusing on, both in terms of our storytelling and in terms of our mitzvot and Leil Seder, Pesach, Matzah, and Maror. We respond to the Nishtana with Avadim Ayinu, with the tale of how we were slaves, and then we have 2 pieces that talk about how we need to tell the story. We've gotten started. We've gone through the very basics, as it were, but now, before we can really get into the full-fledged Magid and the ways in which it's going to integrate different strands of the Pesach story, as well as Hallel and praise to Hashem, we need to talk about what it means to tell this story. We've gotten ourselves interested. We've gotten our children interested. We've whet their appetite. We've given them an initial response. We've highlighted some of the key elements of our story. And now we have to make sure that everyone understands how important this story is for us to tell. And then we have this little break in source number 5. And one way to understand this break is almost like a sort of Birchas HaTorah in the middle of the Magid. We're about to go in and darshan out some verses. We're going to darshan out some verses exegetically working through different strands of how the Torah talking about Yetziat Mitzrayim, and we're going to do it using the framework of talking about the 4 sons. So we've talked about telling the story, and now we have to talk about whom we tell the story to. And if you think about it, that's a preoccupation we already saw in the Mishnah, because already in the Mishnah, we had this question of, is the child going to have the dot? Is the kid going to be up to asking the question? How do we work with the kids who know how to ask the question? And how do we work with the kids who don't? Not only that, in fact, the line that kind of is a transition in the Mishnah from the Nishtana to Rabban Gamliel is Lefi da'ato shel ben aviv melamdo. In accordance with the dot, again, the level, the awareness of the child, that's how the father is supposed to teach him. That is to say, that Nishtana posed the question, Avadim Ayinu begins the answer, we take a step back. And we take that step back to say, telling the story is really important. We know that from the story of the Rabbanim who stayed up all night. We know that from the way in which Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah learns new things about the story, even later on in his life than he thought he would. And that new thing is how important it is to tell the story day and night at all times. And now we're going to see another facet of how to tell the story, how really to enact the Mishnah's instruction that we have to tell the story in accordance with the level or nature or cognizance of each child. And before we do that, we have a bracha to Kadosh Baruch Hu for the Torah that he gives us. And then we lead into Keneged Arbad Banim Dibra Torah. Okay, that the Torah tells us about 4 different children. And the interesting thing is actually that at the very end of the Arba Banim, we have a perfect segue to the next section. The end of the story of the Arba Banim is going to end with quoting the verse of Vigadta levincha bayom hahu lemor bavur zeh asa Hashem li b'tzeiti b'Mitzrayim, and you will say to your child on that day, you will tell your child on that day, saying, it is on account of this that Hashem did for me in taking me out of Egypt. We'll get back to that pasuk and what it means. And that pasuk, which ends our understanding or analysis of the four children, also leads us into more midrashim of psukim. That's where we go when we actually do classic midrash halacha on this pasuk. Right after Arba Banim, we start talking about, oh, could you have done it already from Rosh Chodesh Nisan? No, the pasuk says Bayomahu, etc., etc., etc. So that's kind of like the flow that leads into the Arba Banim. And if that's correct, and a lot of this is building on very important work that was done by Rabbi Dr. Yosef Tabori many years ago. Now, if that is correct, then the key element of what we're doing here in talking about the Arbat Banim is that we're trying to set ourselves up to know how to tell the story in different ways in accordance with the needs of different people. And the second thing that we're doing is we're saying that that was inspired not just by the line in the Mishnah that said we have to do it, but by the Torah itself. Okay, so let's look at how the Torah talks about how we're going to talk with our children about Yetziat Mitzrayim. All right, let's start. There's a few different sets of psukim here. We'll take them one at a time. First, source number 3, Shmot Yud Aleph Tebet. Vayomer Hashem Moshe. This is the beginning of Parshat Bo. Hashem says to Moshe Rabbeinu, Bo el Paro, ki ani ichbadti et libo. Come to Paro because I've hardened his heart, or caused his heart to be heavy. That lev avadav, and the hearts of his servants, leman shiti atoti ela bikirbo, in order that I can place these signs in his midst. Uleman tesaper bo'oznei bincha uven bincha et asher italalti mimitzrayim, and in order that you will tell your children and your children's children what I caused to happen in Mitzrayim, vetatotai asher samti bam, and the signs that I put among them, vidatem ki ani Hashem, and then you're going to know that I am God. This is an extraordinary verse because it tells us that Hashem has more than one goal in setting up Yetziat Mitzrayim the way that he does. That from the outset, one of the goals is theological. Ultimately, that we should know that God is God, but that theological goal from the beginning is going to be met not just by the wonders and signs that are done in the here and now, but by our commitment to retell the story of the wonders and signs in the here and now. Hashem makes the story happen so that we have a story to tell. From the beginning, this is not just supposed to be an event that we experience. It's supposed to be an event that we experience and that we tell our children about. That's essential from the beginning. That's in the DNA of Yetziat Mitzrayim, is telling our children. Okay, well, what are these children going to say and how is this going to work? So first example, Shmot Yud Bet, Chaf Dalet Chaf Zayin. We just read this, Parshat HaChodesh. This is where we learn about Korban Pesach. And the Torah tells us, Ushmartem et hadavar hazeh l'chok lecha uvanecha ad olam. You're going to keep this matter as an ordinance for you and your children forever. Ve'aya, and it will be. Ki tavo'u el haaretz asher yiten Hashem lachem, kasher diber. That when you come into the land that God will give you, as he spoke, Ushmartem et ha'avodah azot, and you keep this divine service, i.e., Korban Pesach, your children are going to ask, what's happening with Korban Pesach? What is Korban Pesach? What is this avodah for you? And then v'amartem, you will say, Zevach Pesach hu l'Hashem asher pasach al betei bnei Yisrael b'Mitzrayim. This is the Korban Pesach. It's brought to God because he hopped over the homes of Bnei Yisrael b'Mitzrayim, b'nekvot Mitzrayim, when he smote the Egyptians, v'batenu itzil, but he saved our homes. V'yikod ha'am v'yishachavu, and the entire nation hears that this is a story we're going to tell, and they bow down. So not only embedded in the actual events is the purpose of telling a story, but embedded in our understanding of Korban Pesach from the get-go is to understand that the name Pesach is symbolic, that it tells us a key element of the story, and that our job is going to be not just to bring the korban, but to communicate to future generations what this korban represents. Source number 5. And it will be when God brings you into the land of the 7 goyim that God has promised to us, the land flowing with milk and honey. You're going to do this divine service at this time. Shivat yamim tochal matzot. For 7 days, you're going to eat matzah. And on the 7th day, it's a festival for God. Matzot yachel et shivat hayamim. You're going to eat the matzah all 7 days. You're not going to have chametz. You're not going to have like sourdough starter. In all of your borders. Why am I eating matzah? You're going to tell your child on that day when you're eating matzah that you're eating it because of what God did for me when I left Egypt. There are actually 2 ways to understand this last pasuk. It could either be, I'm eating it because of what God did for me, on account of the story to remember it. Now I eat it. Or back to kind of our Laman Tesapir, Bavur Zeh, in order that I could do this, in order that I could tell you the story and eat matzah, God did what he did when I came out of Egypt. Okay? Now, what's interesting here is here a child doesn't ask, but we spontaneously tell. And this is where we get the language of Haggadah from, the Higadta Levincha, you'll tell your child, Haggadah. Okay? And we share freely without having been specifically asked because matzah has to be explained. Or perhaps we're given the mitzvah of matzah so that we will be explaining it. Okay, next source is from Chumash. Number 6. Are you getting a theme? And it will be when God brings you into the land of the Canaanite. Every time God's bringing us into the land. As was promised to you, Lavotecha and your forefather, Untana lach, and gave to you, Vavarta kol peter rechem lashem, v'chol peter sheger be'ma asher yelecha ascharim lashem. This is where we're talking about the din, the halacha of the bechor, the firstborn of an animal. And then we go on to talk about the peter chamor, tifteh baseh, and also the special laws of the firstborn of a donkey. Vim lo tifteh v'arafto. Okay, and if you don't redeem the firstborn of the donkey, you have to behead it. And then we get into us. V'chol bechor adam bevanecha tifteh, and you will always redeem. We do pidyon ben. You will redeem your firstborn. V'haya hishalcha bincha machar lemor mazot, and it will be when, in some future time, machar, your child will ask, what is this? Why are we doing a pidyon ben? Why are there special halachot related to the bechor, whether human or animal? V'amarta elav, and you will say to him, B'chozek yad hotzeini Hashem mitzrayim mibeit avadim, that Hashem took us out from Egypt, from the house of bondage, with a strong arm. Vayhi ksha paro l'shalchenu, and when Paro made himself hard and didn't want to send us, then vayarog Hashem kol bechor be'eretz Mitzrayim. Hashem killed all the bechorot. I want to argue it's not perfect, but I think you can see the seeds in it, that in these kind of 3 parallel sources that we've just looked at, where we're coming into the land and the child's asking us a question, again, we see the themes of Pesach, Matzah, and Maror. Pesach is pretty easy. The first one is explicitly about the Korban Pesach. The second one also. We're told, V'igata levincha is in the context. You have to tell your child, who didn't even ask in this case, and you have to tell that child in the context of explaining why you eat matzah. And then this last one, I think we could perhaps claim that this idea of Paro not wanting to send us out harkens us back to the difficulties of slavery. Again, we kind of have a triad of situations that are connecting us to these themes of Pesach, Matzah, or Maror. And here in the last source, we have, and this is already in Sefer Devarim, okay? All of the other sources that we saw so far were in Shmot, talking about around the time of Yetziat Mitzrayim. Here we have in the recap in Chumash Dvarim, Ki yishalcha bincha machar lemor, ma edut v'achukim v'mishpatim asher tzivah Hashem Elokeinu etchem. When your child asks you in the future saying, what are these laws bearing witness, these ordinances, these statutes that God commanded you, v'marta levincha, you will say to your child, avadim hayinu lefaro b'mitzrayim, we were servants of Paro and Mitzrayim, v'yotzieni Hashem Mitzrayim b'yad chazakah, and Hashem took us out of Mitzrayim with a strong arm. And then it continues, okay? So this last one also talks about Avdut, arguably connected again to the idea of Maror, but it's much more, it's getting specific about the halachot, but much more general in terms of the context of the question. Now, how do you take this raw material, or rather, how did Chazal take this raw material and come to the conclusion that Keneged Arba Banim Dibra Torah, that the Torah was talking about 4 sons? First of all, we saw 5 sets of psukim, but the sets of psukim we saw, remember, the first one was really kind of just like a heading. The first one was saying, Hashem is doing this, Leman Tisaper. One of the reasons for Yetziat Mitzrayim to start with is that you're going to tell this story. But it didn't reflect a specific type of dialogue or speech to a specific kid. The other 4 did. So we have in Chumash 4 separate instances where we're told that we're going to speak specifically, sounds like to a kid, or the kid is going to speak to us. And Chazal take these 4, and they identify within the 4 different sons. Now, it's not obvious how we go from these psukim to the 4 different sons. If we look back at the psukim, and if we had to identify it off the top of our head, some of these would be easier than others. For example, in Dvarim, where the son asks this detailed question that seems to distinguish between different types of halacha, edot, chukim, mishpatim, it's very plausible to say, okay, this kid is someone who's more knowledgeable. That kind of lines up with our idea of who might be a chacham. Here, in source number 5, Vigata levincha b'yomahu, and you will tell your child on that day when you're eating matzah, doesn't indicate that the child asked anything. It sounds like we have to tell even though the child didn't ask. So it's not a huge leap to get from here to she'eino yodea lishol, a child who does not know how to ask a question. Here, the child didn't initiate the conversation. It breaks the pattern of the other sets that talk about the child initiating and it seems like, responding. So that also seems to line up very nicely. When the child says, ma zot, right? We're doing the laws of Bechorot, we're doing Pidyon Haben, and the child's answer is, what is this? I think it's also on a pshat level, not a very, very far stretch, to say that this child is not necessarily someone who's very rich in understanding. On the other hand, this sounds like it's a child who's very open to understanding. Mazod is an extremely open question. So it's not a sophisticated question, but it's coming from a position of really wanting to know as much as possible. So again, here, I think it's not too far a stretch to say that this might be what we call our tam. Okay, and we'll get back to what the tam is, usually translated as the simple son. The trickiest one is probably the one that gives everyone the most trouble at the Seder as well. And that's the first one about the child asking with Korban Pesach, where your children say, Ma avodah hazot lachem. What is this avodah, this divine service, to you? Now, we know that in the tale of the Arba Banim, we're going to call this the Rasha. It's not clear. It's not fully clear from within the text why we would call this the Rasha. The response, perhaps, one possibility is to say that this response, Ve'amartem, is not even a response. Maybe there's already an indication. In the other cases, we had Ve'amarta elav, Vigadta levincha. You're going to respond to him. You're going to tell your child. Here it just says Ve'amartem, you will say. Maybe it's even not relating to what the son says. Maybe anytime someone brings a Pesach, they have to talk about the symbolism, irrespective of whether a child is there. So maybe there's a subtle cue that we're not responding to this kid. And maybe we're not responding to this kid for a reason. The Perush Akedat Yitzchak, which I saw brought also by Nechama Leibovich, brings a pasuk from Yoshua to try to explain this reading of the kid as a Rasha. In Yoshua, we have frequently actually in Sefer Yoshua, we have a concern about how future generations are going to understand what it meant to come into and conquer the land and what we're all about. And Yeshua is concerned about Machar Yomru Bnechem Levanenu Lemor Malachem V'Lashem Elokei Yisrael. Tomorrow, your children might say to our children, what's between you and God? There's something about the phrasing of Malachem that perhaps, and I say perhaps because it's not an obvious read, but perhaps a very, very delicate ear for the language of Chumash would hear in this question of Ma ha'avodah hazot lachem, some echo of that language in Sefer Yoshua, that there's something about the what is this to you that is not how respectful questions get asked in Chumash. Now, the next natural question, which also comes up all the time in Lila Seder, is, well, look again here. Isn't that what happened here with the Chacham? Ma'edut v'achokim v'mishpatim asher tziva Hashem Elokeinu etchem. Doesn't that also say what God commanded you? Why is that different? But the difference, first of all, we have Hashem Elokeinu. The child is recognizing that God is our God. And secondly, and here's the key thing, it's not necessarily a quote. Okay, again, this is on the Haggadah of Nechama Leibovich, quoting Rav David Tzvi Hoffman. Here, this etchem is really, we're being talked to. We're saying, here's what your kids are going to say to you. They're going to say to you, what are these things to you? But we're not said that the kid is actually going to say etchem. Or in fact, in some manuscripts of the Arba Banim, the end of this verse is missing because it's not the key point. And in other versions of the Arba Banim, it says actually otanu, as though to correct for the fact, to us, as though to correct for the fact that the verse is telling us what the kids are going to say to you, but it's not actually a direct quote of their speech. Okay, so those are possible ways that we could have gotten from the psukim themselves to our classification of 4 sons. Now, there's something a little interesting that happens with these 4, which is that once we've identified them, we can start asking how we got these specific types as being our key personality types, aside from just the Chumash, and how we got the answers that we got. So, for example, the Chacham, we said it makes some sense that someone asking such a detailed question would be a Chacham, especially if we leave off, as some manuscripts do, the end of the Pasuk, which talks about etchem. And here, perhaps we don't answer with the response that we find in Chumash Devarim, because the response in Chumash Devarim is Avadim Hayinu. And you'll remember, we already said that at the Seder. Now we're talking about, our focus in the Arba Banim is not how Chumash said to answer these boys. Our focus in Arba Banim is how do we tell the story to different people, to different types of children? And if we're talking about how to tell it to different types of children, then perhaps the appropriate response here, Avadim Hayinu, is good for everybody. But here, if someone's really going to be asking us about a detailed taxonomy of mitzvot that relate to Pesach, then really it would seem that perhaps we have to tell them all of Hilchot Pesach, ending with the end of the Seder, the Afikoman. Okay, we'll get back to the Rasha. The Tam is perfect. It's exactly what we see in Chumash. The Chumash has the Tam saying, what is this? Open-ended question. And the answer is exactly what we say. The simplest possible expression of the story, that God with a strong arm took us out of Egypt from the house of bondage. This is everything that's essential for this child to know, and it's exactly what Chumash says. She'eino yodea lishol also is exactly what we have in the Chumash. No question is there, and we have a response. If we think again about the Mishnah and how we started, the Mishnah indicated that there were going to be the kids who knew how to ask and the kids who didn't know how to ask. So this really fulfills the Mishnah's anticipation that some kids are not going to know how to ask. And our job in that case is at petachlo. We open it up for them. We initiate for them. The Tam, the Chacham, we've gone through. The trickiest one, once again, is the Rasha. And here, what's so fascinating to me is actually not specifically the response. This is, if you're going to call yourself Lachem, that it's about you, you're taking yourself out. I'm also, as it were, going to say that you were out, you're not in the picture. What's fascinating is how this is characterized. This is characterized in our Haggadah as kafar be'ikar. This, I think, is particularly resonant actually nowadays when we face so many enemies and we have questions about what is and is not legitimate criticism of Israel, of Zionism, of the Jewish people, and our reactions to October 7th worldwide. And something that's so fascinating is this kafar beikar is usually we talk about someone who's being heresy with regard to God. And here there's a sense of taking oneself out of the collective indicates that one is missing something very fundamental about following God. But the other thing that's amazing about the discussion with the Rasha is this phrase that afata hakhet shinav. Okay, you shall set his teeth on edge. Now, you shall set his teeth on edge is a very harsh response. And it continues with talking about you might not have been redeemed yourself. But what's significant about you shall set his teeth on edge is that this is a phrase, a parable that shows up a couple of times in Sefer Yirmiyahu and also in Sefer Yechezkel. And it's a phrase that comes up in the context of a fundamental theological question, which is when a father sins, is the child the one who bears responsibility? So one of the things happening with our response to the Rasha is in fact coming down very harshly on the idea that someone would completely take themselves out of the collective or of recognizing themselves as being part of the commanded people. But another thing that's happening implicitly is that we're being challenged to consider how that Rasha is our child. To what extent are they responsible for their deeds? To what extent are we responsible for their deeds? And what does that all mean? Because at the end of the day, I always like very much what Rav Lichtenstein pointed out in one of his discourses on the four sons. There might be four children, but there's one parent. That one parent has to see each child, but that one parent also has to take responsibility in seeing each child and telling the story for each child, for being the parent to all of them. Okay, I hope that's a good start in getting ready to understand Nishtana the Arba Banim. We have like a minute to look at any questions for chat. How does a child know how to ask about the reason for the two dippings when he or she has only seen so far one dipping? So if you were from a society where they dip once and you've seen one dipping, have they? That's a good question. Yeah, I don't know. I think that there's some level of anticipation. It might support the idea that, in fact, this would have been the person leading the Seder or the parent's response. Or perhaps also that it wouldn't have been such a formal, ritualized type of asking, but something much more natural taking place over the course of the evening, meaning it doesn't have to be that Nishtana, that all of the child's questions should not be taken up with the Nishtana, right? And shouldn't only inhabit a certain 5-minute moment of the Seder. If the core of the Vigadta Levincha, if the reason why we have to tell is only in the scenario where the child didn't ask, because ideally the child is asking and we're telling because it's Laman Tisapir, that's why God did what he did, then really our goal should be not for the child just to have to see things to ask, but not for the child just to ask at one moment, but for the child throughout Lila Seder to be engaged and to be asking questions. Okay, I think I'm over time. Stop.
Thank you. If I may, I think that's a proof. I think Mordechai Breuer addresses that question in his fantastic article on the Perkei Moedot, and he explains that this the Seder used to be. They used to eat the meal before they did the Seder, before they did Magi, because of the Korban Pesach. They wanted to eat the Korban Pesach before midnight. So you came home, you made Kiddush, whatever, in your Beit HaMikdash, you made Kiddush, you ate the whole meal, and no question, everything was done after the meal. So the kid had seen the two dippings, but that we don't have time for that now. But if you want to Perkei Mordechai, it's a very interesting article. And thank you very much, Laurie. Should have Chag Kasher b'Sameach.
Thank you so much. Chag Kasher b'Sameach. I'm so sorry I can't stay for the next.